I don't know whether I have 10 minutes worth of remarks. I'll try. I should say at the front end, I am very uncertain about many of these things, not just the empirics, but on how to think about it. So I'm not the voice of authority here at all. Let me start with Ross's remarks. I mean, I think we agreed on a ton of things. In particular, that there are, I mean, the connections that people often draw between inequality and other bad stuff they observe are not remotely as direct as one might, as is frequently portrayed. I also agree that inequality, and I hope I said, inequality is sort of caused by an awful lot of things that we ought to be concerned about. I agree with Ross that sort of the sexual revolution has a lot to do with it. I also think there's nothing anybody can do about it. I mean, it's just very bad to lose revolutions, okay? You can ask the Catholic Church in France how that shakes out. And we've lost that revolution. There's nothing you can do. Ross described one of the things that he worries about, which one of my former colleagues, David Schleicher, who's now at Yale, calls agglomeration economics. So people sort themselves and the process feeds on itself. And you see this, it's not exactly Charles Murray stuff, okay? What Charles Murray describes is Highland Park or McLean, super zips where the rich sort of segregate themselves. I think they'll always find a way to segregate themselves. What Ross was describing is more like Arlington or Washington or New York, right? Young people who sort of congregate in the same places because that's where they find their peers, that's where they find their wives or their husbands. I'll say this, what David's studies are about is sort of government policies that sometimes unwittingly, but frequently deliberately, foster those kinds of trends. And that is actually something to worry about, right? Because of the way it works is sort of people congregate in sort of desirable places, and the next thing you know is they mobilize the machinery of government to keep it that way and pull up the drawbridges. I would park that under sort of what I tried to describe as political dysfunction. It is something to worry about, among other things, sort of labor market mismatches, a whole lot of stuff that has really unfortunate economic consequences. I'm no expert on that, but I think David is a very bright guy. I'm also not sure how much Bill and I disagree on these matters, but I want to take up one central point he focused on, and that's the point about democratic stability and what he described as the sort of liberal democratic bargain. The way this started, and maybe, Bill, I'm misinterpreting you, and it's just a question I have. Said, when the system doesn't produce prosperity anymore for most people, then the institutions themselves come beleaguered, or in those kinds of terms. I wonder about that. It was very, very famous article of faith almost in European countries. It's called the social democratic consensus, right? So the idea is we have to have economic growth because we can redistribute the surplus, so to speak, the growth. We cannot redistribute stuff in a zero-sum society because people will just fight back too hard. I think there's a great deal to that. I'm not so sure that the political stability of the United States depends on it. I'm not even sure it's true of Germany, although a lot of people were, understandably worried about that might be true. So in the 1960s, when the growth started to decline, people said, "Ooh, oh, here we go again," because what really holds this country together is the German mark and prosperity, and not anything having to do with politics. I think traditionally we've thought of our institutions as a little more robust and stable than that. I think stability comes, but this is not to say I disagree with you vehemently. There's a great deal, I think, to it. I think political stability or instability comes in sort of several shapes and forms. I think we're not going to have riots in the streets and, unrest of a very sort of unpeaceful kind. And the reason for that is I think that Americans are too demoralized, and their expectations of government institutions are so low already that that's not going to happen. What I'm much more worried about is Brazil, or a different aspect of Brazil. My country of choice would not have been Brazil, but Argentina. I've written this up, actually. The way politics eventually shakes out in those kinds of countries is Peronism. That is sort of hardcore executive government, and all the rest of the institutions are flat on their backs. And I think we've come a long way in that direction, unfortunately. And so if I worry about a sort of kind of political instability, is more sort of declining political health, sort of dysfunction that then sort of collapses into let the president do it on his own, whether or not there's a legal basis, whether or not the Congress was in favor of it, and whatever the courts have to say is also not of interest. I want to emphasize that is a trend that has accompanied our politics for quite some time now. It's not just a thing of the Obama administration, although it has taken rather dramatic forms. I think under any presidency we will see more of the same in the future, because the institutions have just ceased to function. And so that is really something that I worry about. If you want to describe that as political instability, yeah, I'm on board with that.
Well, working as I do in the epicenter of polarization and dysfunction, my instinct, and it gets me into no end of trouble on a regular basis, is to be more attracted to areas of agreement than disagreement. That is, I'm more interested in building on common ground, flooding the beachhead, if you will, than I am in putting a chisel to the differences. And so I would really, in my 10 minutes, like to focus on common ground and explore the extent to which it persists as common ground when I move the argument forward a step or two. I think both of you made the argument that we benefit from some forms of inequality. And that's true. That is absolutely true. And I guess my addition to that thought would be the fact that some inequality is good doesn't mean that more inequality is better. From the standpoint of a bunch of economic and social goods, there may actually be a kind of a Laffer's curve of inequality. No, seriously. I can make what I believe to be very cogent arguments to the effect that beyond a certain point, inequality becomes troublesome. It becomes troublesome economically, it becomes troublesome socially, and I think eventually politically. And so there is an empirical argument, it seems to me, if you're with me so far, as to where that point is, at which we have clearly gone too far in one direction or another. Either we've gone so far in trying to repress difference and inequality in the name of equal treatment and even equal results that the dynamism of the society is repressed, or alternatively, when you've let inequality go so far that various sorts of social differences become exacerbated, and I would argue you tend to have slower economic growth because the propensity to consume at the very upper reaches is significantly lower than it is at the lower reaches. So you have to make all sorts of assumptions about what's going to happen to that capital in order to break even. And I think it's pretty clear that a lot of that capital is just lying around idle at this point. Another area of agreement, and here I'll just play back something that Ross said very, very emphatically. You said, and I'll just use some ellipses here, that Brazil is unjust. You used the word unjust, and I agree with that. But I think what that means is, as soon as we introduce terms like justice into the conversation, we are contemplating not only the possibility but the probability that the distribution that you get from an economy running on the principle to each according to his marginal product may very well fall short along other dimensions of evaluation. Justice and injustice do not map neatly onto the unfettered output of the economic system. There's always the possibility of a divergence. There's always the possibility that the divergence is so significant as to require redress. And if moral suasion is not enough to narrow the gulf between the economically produced distribution and some rough and ready but widely held conception of justice, then public policy has to fill the gap. And I think the only way to avoid that conclusion is to reject concerns of justice and injustice as autonomous dimensions of political evaluation. And if anybody wants to take that position, I'd be happy to have that argument. Let me go to another point of emphatic agreement, and that is the issue of family structure, which both Michael and Ross have written about. I have written about for a quarter of a century now, including most recently, just last week. I couldn't agree more. I am plenty old enough to remember the times during the rise of the counterculture when the argument was that the highly educated would be the ruin of themselves, and if we were not careful, the nation as a whole. And it would take the morals and the mores of the sturdy working class to save us from disaster. So here we are now, almost half a century later, and guess what? The college educated are getting married and staying married, and the working class, when they get married, get divorced very quickly. And both Charles Murray and Robert Putnam, starting with very different authorial intentions, have converged on exactly that divergence. That raises a very interesting question. Why the collapse of marital stability, not just among the poor, but also the working class? And as Charles Murray, I think, has correctly pointed out, the marital instability is creeping up the economic ladder. My answer to that question, for what it's worth, is that the stable marital patterns of the working class in 2 generations ago were very much dependent on stable economic prospects. Right? Men, in particular, and I'm not arguing for the 1950s style family, but working men had something to offer to women. That is, stable employment that they could rely on, a stream of income that was administered through large corporations and unions, and which enabled people to contemplate spending 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years in the same plant, in the same place, in the same town. So I don't think the issue of marital stability can be decoupled from the question of economic stability. Which brings me to my last point. I think that social systems are more like biological organisms than they are like the sorts of things that Newtonian mechanics governs. And so it may be that the same phenomenon is simultaneously a cause and an effect. I am comfortable with the proposition that Ross put on the table that inequality matters in part because it's a consequence of other bad things. I think that's right. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that inequality is also a source of bad things. The causal arrow can and almost certainly does work in both directions. So I don't see a contradiction between these two perspectives. I think that they could very easily be seen as complementary, and indeed that's the way that I see them. And so, and the family structure discussion is a perfect example of that, that two-way causality, because it is perfectly true that unstable families are not conducive to the economic well-being of the family unit. It's also true that economic instability and poor economic prospects constitute obstacles to family stability. It works both ways. And so I think if we take a comprehensive view, inequality is both an effect and a cause, and we need to put those two perspectives together.
I feel like I should be trying to find some point of vicious disagreement where we can all tear each other apart. But we probably need someone. Well, we need someone further to the left than Bill, or further to the right than the two of us to really. Maybe in the Q&A, someone can stand up for those views. I guess instead of arguing directly, I'll just talk a little bit about sort of one of the underlying issues that I think we're all sort of touching on here, which is the term I like to use and have used is to describe our current situation is decadence. And decadence is a useful term, I think, because it captures a couple points. One, it captures the sense of stagnation that I think pervades Western politics and political economy right now. And two, it captures a sort of equally important reality, which is that this stagnation is happening at a very high point of economic development. So you can't have, a society that's desperately poor and stagnant is not a decadent society because it hasn't really achieved liftoff or sort of achieved heights of growth and prosperity and progress. Only a wealthy society, only an advanced civilization in whatever historical form it takes can be described as decadent. And I think that combination of sort of stagnation but also this high level of prosperity gets at some of the challenges that all three of us are sort of working our way around. And one way of looking at it is that, and this is sort of, I think, gets to both the question of sort of justice and the question of political stability in certain ways, right? Which is that there are a couple ways in which I would describe the political and economic landscape of many Latin American countries over the last 100 years as unjust. One is that they're unjust in the sense that the way in which wealth is accumulated and passed down partakes of more sort of dishonesty and self-dealing and less free competition than I think overall has been the case in the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't all kinds of self-dealing and so on. And again, this is where we need someone further to the left to hurl tomatoes at me and explain the sort of inherent corruption of capitalism. But I think it's fair to say that there is there is more injustice in the way wealth is often accumulated in Peronist, let's say, political economy than in Anglo-Saxon political economy. There's more injustice in the way that, to use an example close to my own newspaper, Carlos Slim, who is an investor in the New York Times, seems to have gotten wealthy in the Mexican telecommunications industry than there is injustice in the way that Bill Gates and Steve Jobs got rich, for instance. Now, obviously, Bill Gates came from a wealthy family, and there are plenty of cases of self-dealing and licensing and so on in the American economy. But I think you can multiply more of those examples in the Latin American context. So that's one way in which Latin America I would describe as more unjust. But the other way is a way in which I suppose I would be more, I'd be comfortable and sort of on common ground with a more left-wing interlocutor, which is I think there is injustice when a certain segment of society enjoys extraordinary levels of wealth and another segment of society experiences extraordinary levels of poverty. And that has been much more the case, again, in Latin America than it has been the case in the US or Western Europe. And that's been true going back a long time, but it's certainly been true over the last 50 or 60 years. And you just have to visit, the shanty towns around a major Latin American city to observe this, that there are levels of poverty coexisting with levels of affluence that even American slums and the American underclass, except in extreme situations, I don't think match. Now, what I think is interesting about our situation now is that we are increasingly, American political economy is in certain ways being Latin Americanized. In ways I think all three of us agree, but and this is the aspect of inequality in certain ways that conservatives and libertarians have become most comfortable talking about, especially in the Obama era. They'll be less comfortable talking about it once a Republican is in office and we're talking about corporate welfare for Exxon instead of corporate welfare for Solyndra. Was that the one? Yeah, Solyndra, right. So, but right now conservatives and libertarians will always be comfortable. Conservatives will, check to see who's in the White House first. But there's a comfort with saying, look, America has more crony capitalism than we should have, that this is bound up, conservatives would argue, in the growth of the regulatory state, regulatory capture, and so on. But there's no question at some level that the scope of sort of self-dealing and corporate governmental entanglement in American political economy is rising, and that has creates all kinds of problems, but it creates problems of justice in the sense that I think we would agree on, in addition to problems of economic stagnation and sclerosis and so on. But what America isn't experiencing right now is a sort of real deep immiseration of the poor and working class. And this is a case where, again, there are sort of lots of different arguments with lots of different controls about what has actually happened to working class income over the last 40 or 50 years. But as far as I can tell, the best data suggests that what we've seen is stagnation but not substantial decline. And when you combine that with the fact that we did put in place large-scale expansions of the welfare state in the 1960s and 1970s, you have a situation where it's hard to make the case that the American poor and the American working class are getting worse and worse off in absolute terms. Now, they may be getting worse off in relative terms, but that's sort of a separate moral and economic argument. But in terms of where there is, I think, common ground between center-right and center-left or whatever is represented here, it's that if the poor were being immiserated, if the working class were seeing their incomes collapse absolutely, even as the rich were getting richer and richer, we would have a sort of second problem of justice, compounding the problem of justice that you see in sort of self-dealing crony capitalism and so on. But I don't think we do, which means that the sort of problems facing the working class family, the problems facing working class men, and so on. These are problems more of stagnation than of impoverishment. And that in turn has implications for the stability of the underlying system. And this gets back to, I guess I'll end here since it is a slight point of disagreement between maybe Bill and the two of us, which is that precisely because you don't have deep immiseration, you don't have the kind of fear of, well, you don't have the experience of loss that could, it seems to me, to overgeneralize wildly, that you get political upheaval in periods of massively rising expectations and periods of sort of deep, profound crisis. And we're in this sort of middle zone where America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And even if America's poor aren't technically as well off as the poor in Denmark by some measures, it's still the case that by any historical comparison, the American poor and working class are rich. And what that means is that you have, as long as that remains sort of stable, even in stagnation, even in ways that sort of encourage family breakdown and sort of social disarray and, you know, rising mortality rates among 50-something white men and all these things, but as long as there's a sense of sort of stability rather than collapse, people will be very risk averse, I think, and unlikely to really roll the dice on the kind of bigger political upheavals, the bigger populist upheavals that I think Bill is maybe a little bit more worried about than we are. And I should stress, I'm not sure that's great news. I don't think decadence is a wonderful, I mean, decadence is preferable to Weimar, right? But it's not necessarily preferable to, you know, America 1945 to 1970. It's clearly not.
Well, Weimar started with decadence and ended with collapse.
Well, right, and my definition of decadent, yeah, right, exactly. You can sort of, but anyway, I'm just saying. I think that in certain ways our problem is that we have a sort of that we have a kind of sustainable decadence, basically, and the sort of inequality debate is bound up in that, and where I think the more extreme left almost wants to believe that inequality is actually immiserating Americans, because that would mean that the system was more unstable and ripe for, you know, Occupy Wall Street type revolution. But Occupy Wall Street didn't find a lot of takers outside the community of students and activists. And it didn't find takers, again, I think because people felt that their incomes were stagnant, that things weren't great, that they had reduced expectations, that it was sort of a depressing situation, but it wasn't so bad that they were willing to risk, to gamble on real upheaval. And this is also why I don't think Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. So I'll leave things there.